Have you ever stopped to think if your consciousness is really yours? If what you call me is just an illusion constructed by your mind? What if everything you feel, think, and perceive is just a hologram, a virtual experience within a larger system? If this idea causes you a certain amount of discomfort, good. It's precisely this discomfort that can open doors to a truth that few are prepared to face. Your I doesn't exist in the way you believe, but what is this entity we call consciousness? What are we really? In this book, we will explore what neuroscientists, philosophers, and ancient spiritual traditions say about the illusion of the I, and why understanding this truth can completely transform your outlook on life, reality, and existence itself. Prepare yourself. Once you see this truth, there's no turning back. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever had an experience where you felt that reality was false or manipulated? A déjà vu, a lucid dream, a moment when you felt it wasn't really you? Write in the comments. Your experience may be more significant than you think. Now take a deep breath. Let's start dismantling your identity. Have you ever noticed how your mind is never in one place for very long? You may be here reading these words, but at the same time, your brain may be thinking about what you're going to do next, about a problem that happened yesterday, or about a distant memory from childhood. And the strangest thing, that voice in your head, the one reading these words, the one judging, analyzing, and questioning, is it really you? The biggest illusion we carry around is the belief that we are a fixed entity, a cohesive and continuous I. But science and philosophy have shown that this idea is false. The me you believe yourself to be is just a constantly changing process. The neuroscience of the self-neuroscientists such as Anil Seth and David Eagleman explain that consciousness is not a single entity, but a set of processes in the brain interacting with each other. Our identity is like a theater, a well-crafted illusion in which different parts of the brain create the sensation of continuity. The prefrontal cortex creates the sensation of planning and decision-making. The limbic system generates emotions and instinctive responses. The hippocampus organizes memories and gives us a sense of personal history. But here's the rub. None of these parts operates in an isolated and fixed way. Everything changes all the time. So, where exactly is the I? The philosophy of no self. This question is not new. Buddhism, for example, already spoke of the concept of anatta, or not self, more than 2,500 years ago. Buddha taught that there is no permanent I, but rather a stream of thoughts, emotions, and perceptions in constant flux. This means that what you believe to be you today is not the same as it was 5 years ago or even yesterday. Your body has changed, your ideas have changed, your memories have reorganized. So who are you now? Experiments that expose the illusion. The famous Colosso body cut experiment, carried out on patients with severe epilepsy, showed something frightening. When the brain is split in half, each hemisphere begins to operate independently, creating two separate consciousnesses within the same person. This means that the I can be fragmented. If we can split consciousness, then how can it be a single real entity? If the I is just an illusion, why do we feel this continuity? The answer lies in what neuroscientists call the predictive model of the brain. Our brains don't perceive the world directly, but through internal simulations based on past experiences and predictions of the future. This means that everything you see, feel, and experience is filtered through this simulation, creating the illusion of a cohesive reality. Neuroscientist Anil Seth describes consciousness as a controlled hallucination, where the brain constructs a consistent story so that we can interact with the world without constantly wondering about our own existence. The problem is that this story isn't entirely real. Your brain constantly edits, distorts, and fills in gaps. Have you ever noticed how your memory changes over time? You remember something clearly, but years later you discover that some details were wrong or never happened? This is because memory is not a fixed file, but a fluid construction that your brain reorganizes according to new contexts and emotions. If your identity is based on memory, and memory is changeable, then your identity is also an illusion. One of the most fascinating experiments on this is the rubber hand experiment. In it, Scientists place a fake hand in front of the person and hide their real hand. By simultaneously touching the real, hidden hand and the fake, visible hand, the brain begins to believe that the fake hand is part of the body. This experiment proves that our brains can be fooled about what is ours and what is not. Now think about it on a deeper level. If the brain can create the illusion of ownership over a fake hand, what else is it creating without you realizing? Eat. If everything you experience is a mental construct, then the most disturbing question arises. Is your self really yours, or is it just a character being played by your brain? If your I is an illusion, then who is making the decisions? Do you really have control over your life, or have your choices already been made before you even realize it? Neuroscience suggests that free will may only be a sensation, not a reality. Benjamin Libet's famous experiment, carried out in the 1980s, showed something impressive. By measuring the brain activity of volunteers while they were making simple decisions, like pressing a button, Libet discovered that the brain initiated the action before the person was even aware of their choice. In other words, your decision had already been made before you decided. This suggests that consciousness is not the origin of decisions, but only a late witness to what has already been determined by your brain. This brings us to an even more disturbing question. If your brain is in control before you even realize it, then who or what is really running your life? Are we just observers of a process that is already underway? Some currents in the philosophy of mind, such as determinism, argue that everything we do is the result of prior causes. Our experiences, genetics, and environment shape every thought and behavior before we even have the chance to choose. But if we don't have a fixed I and our decisions are automatic, what does this mean for our identity? Perhaps what we call free will is just a story we tell ourselves to make sense of the chaos within. Maybe our sense of control is a construct, just like everything else in our consciousness. But if that's true, is there anything we can do to wake up from this illusion? If your identity is an illusion, and your decisions happen before you even realize it, then what about reality itself? What if the world around you is just as illusory as yourself? The idea that we live in a simulation is not just a science fiction theory. It is a hypothesis taken seriously by physicists and philosophers. The simulation argument, popularized by Nick Bostrom, suggests that advanced civilizations could create simulations so detailed that the beings inside them wouldn't realize they were in an artificial environment. If this is true, there is a great possibility that our own existence is one of these simulations. But we don't need to go that far to understand that reality is subjective. Quantum physics already shows us that matter, at the most fundamental level, behaves strangely. The double-slit experiment, one of the most famous in science, demonstrated that subatomic particles change their behavior when they are observed. This suggests that consciousness somehow interacts with the structure of reality. But if reality depends on observation, does it exist objectively, or only as long as there is an observer to perceive it? Also, think about what happens during dreams. When you're dreaming, everything seems real until the moment you wake up. Sounds, textures, sensations, everything seems authentic within the dream. But when you wake up, you realize that it was just a mental construction. Now ask yourself, what if the waking state is just another level of dreaming? A more sophisticated illusion that keeps us convinced that it's the only reality? If you've ever experienced déjà vu, lucid dreams, or altered states of consciousness, you may have felt that reality isn't as solid as it seems. But if everything around us is a simulation, and the I is just a character created by this simulation, what's behind it all? Who or what is operating this reality? If your I is an illusion, and reality can be a mental construct, then the inevitable question arises, who or what is having this experience? If we are not our thoughts, nor our memories, nor our decisions, then who is watching all this happen? Mystics, philosophers, and scientists have been trying to answer this question for centuries. Some spiritual traditions, such as Vedanta, claim that we are not the me we think we are, but the pure consciousness behind all experiences. You are not the character you play in the world. You are the silent spectator, the one who observes, thoughts, emotions, and sensations without being bound by them. Neuroscience also suggests something interesting. The illusion of I doesn't mean that there isn't a process of perception going on. We may not be a fixed entity, but the experience of consciousness continues to exist. This leads us to the idea that the real I may not be an individual, but something broader, an impersonal consciousness flowing through all living beings. Experiences of deep meditation. The use of psychedelics or altered states of consciousness often lead people to report a feeling of ego dissolution. In these experiences, the feeling of being a separate individual disappears, and a perception of oneness with everything arises. Many describe this feeling as an awakening to the fundamental truth. Consciousness is one, and we are all immersed in it. But if this is true, then what we call reality may just be a game of perception. Your body, your history, your thoughts, all this would just be a superficial layer, like a character created by this universal consciousness. And if that's the case, what happens when we finally realize this truth? If everything you believe yourself to be, your identity, your memories, your choices, is just a construct, then what happens when you awaken from this illusion? Many spiritual traditions call this moment enlightenment or awakening of consciousness. It's when the individual realizes directly and irrefutably that they were never a separate I, but rather pure consciousness itself experiencing reality through a temporary body and mind. But this awakening is not just a philosophical concept. It has real and profound implications. People who experience ego dissolution often report a complete change in the way they see the world. The fear of death disappears as they realize that they were never just a body. Attachments and suffering lose their strength as they realize that all emotions are just transient phenomena on the screen of consciousness. Neuroscience has studied these states and discovered that during experiences of enlightenment, certain areas of the brain linked to self-consciousness decrease their activity. This means that the feeling of I dissolves not because something magical happens, but because the brain simply stops reinforcing the illusion of separate identity. But if awakening from this illusion can transform our lives, why do so few people succeed? Because the human mind clings desperately to its history. The illusion of the I is comfortable, familiar, and undoing it means facing the unknown. That's why many spiritual traditions use practices such as meditation, questioning the ego, and altered states of consciousness to help with this process. Now, the final question: if you knew with absolute certainty that you are not who you think you are, that your identity is just a temporary role in a larger theater, how would you live from now on? If you are not your identity, your memories or your thoughts, then what happens when your body dies? Death, which has always been seen as the absolute end, may just be the closing of a cycle within the illusion of the I. Many spiritual traditions teach that the fear of death exists only because we identify with a body and a mind. But if you are no longer that body or mind, then what really dies? Modern physics suggests that consciousness may not be a mere byproduct of the brain, but something fundamental to the universe. Neuroscientist Christoph Koch and physicist Roger Penrose explore the idea that consciousness could be an intrinsic property of reality, just like space and time. This would mean that the death of the body does not mean the end of consciousness, but only a transition of state, like an ocean wave that dissolves only to re-emerge at another point. Near death. Experiences also provide fascinating clues. Many people who have experienced being clinically declared dead report a deep sense of peace, a dissolution of the ego, and a feeling of oneness with something greater. For them, death was not an end, but a return to a wider reality. But if there is no death of consciousness, then what is the purpose of this experience we call life? Perhaps it's just a game, a simulation in which consciousness experiences separation in order to remember that it has always been one. If that's the case, then life doesn't have to be taken as seriously as we imagine. Suffering, fear, and struggle lose their weight when we realize that we are something much greater than a passing body. And now, knowing this, How do you choose to live the time you have here? If death is not the end and identity is an illusion, then what is the purpose of being here? Why does this unlimited consciousness choose to fragment itself into billions of separate I's, believing itself to be each one of them? The answer may lie in the idea that life is not a test, a punishment, or a mystery to be solved, but a game. Many spiritual traditions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, talk about existence as a great Leela, a cosmic game where consciousness manifests itself in different ways to be experienced. Alan Watts, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, explained this with a simple analogy. Imagine that you are an infinite and eternal being, capable of creating any reality you want. If you could do anything for all eternity, you would soon tire of just existing. So for fun, you would decide to forget who you really are and create a game where you become a character, with challenges, emotions, and surprises. This game of existence would explain why we feel duality so deeply: love and fear, joy and suffering, life and death. Without contrast, there would be no experience. If you were eternal and knew it all the time, existence would lose its flavor. But by momentarily forgetting and immersing yourself in the illusion of I, every discovery, every emotion, every challenge becomes meaningful. If this theory is true, then suffering and fear aren't enemies. They're just part of the game. Pain teaches us, challenges shape us, and joy only exists because we know its absence. This means that you don't have to fight life, but learn to play consciously. Instead of blindly identifying with your character, you can start to realize that you are the player behind it. And if you knew that it was all a game, how would you choose to play from now on? If life is a game and the I is only a temporary character, is there a way to wake up from this illusion while we're still here? Many spiritual traditions teach that there is. The first step is to constantly question your own identity. Who are you really? If you can observe your thoughts, then you are not your thoughts. If you can feel emotions, then you're not your emotions either. If you can change your beliefs, then you are not your beliefs. If you can see your body aging, then you're not your body. Who or what is left? This is the central point of practices, such as Advaita Vedanta and Zen Buddhism, which use self-inquiry to dissolve the illusion of I. Ramana Maharshi, one of the great masters of this tradition, said that the only question that matters is, who am I? When you investigate this question deeply, you realize that the answer can never be a fixed identity, but only a space of consciousness in which everything happens. In addition to self-inquiry, there are practices that help dissolve the illusion of the self. Meditation, for example, is not just a relaxation exercise. It allows you to see directly the impermanence of thoughts and the absence of a fixed I. Altered states of consciousness, whether through breathing, silence, or psychedelics, can also open your perception to this truth. But awakening doesn't mean escaping from life or abandoning your identity. On the contrary, it means living it with total presence, knowing that everything is temporary and that you don't need to be attached to anything. Suffering arises from attachment to illusion. When you realize that you no longer need to identify with thoughts, emotions, or circumstances, freedom comes naturally. Now that you know this, what will you choose to do with this realization? Will you continue to live as a character trapped in the narrative, or will you begin to experience life with the lightness of someone who knows that everything is just a game of consciousness? If you are not your identity, your thoughts, your memories, or your body, then what is left? What happens when you completely free yourself from the need to be someone? The answer is simple, and at the same time frightening for the mind. What remains is pure freedom. Many people spend their lives trying to build a solid identity, a defined me that can be recognized and validated by the world. But this identity is like a sandcastle. At any moment, it can be destroyed by external circumstances, by time, or simply by an internal change. True freedom comes when you realize that you don't have to be anything. You don't need to fit into a narrative. You don't need to defend a fixed image of yourself. You don't need to cling to any certainty about who you are. This means you can live more authentically than ever before. Without the weight of identity, you become flexible, open, and free to experience life in its entirety. There is no more fear of failure, because there is no I that needs to protect a reputation. There is no more unnecessary suffering, because there is no I that needs to control everything. There is no more incessant search for validation, because you realize that you are already complete without needing to be someone. This freedom doesn't mean becoming apathetic or indifferent. On the contrary, it means engaging with life, fully knowing that everything is a temporary game. You can love deeply, create, express yourself, feel intensely, but without the attachment that generates suffering. So what happens when you finally accept that you are nothing? You realize that by being nothing, you can be everything. No limitations, no barriers, no fixed identity to imprison you. You become pure consciousness flowing through existence, playing the game of life with lightness, curiosity, and joy. Now, knowing this, how do you choose to live from now on? Even after understanding that the I is an illusion, the mind continues to try to cling to something. It can transform this very understanding into a new identity. I am now someone who knows that the I doesn't exist, creating a new cycle of attachment. This is the ultimate illusion, believing that there is something to achieve, a definitive state of enlightenment or absolute understanding. But what if there is nothing to achieve? What if the search itself is just another mind game? Many spiritual masters say that enlightenment is not something you achieve, but something you realize is present all the time. You are already what you seek. The problem is that the mind, accustomed to living in the illusion of separation, keeps looking for something external to validate this truth. When you finally realize that there is nothing to find, something changes. You stop striving to get there and simply relax into the present. There is no longer any need to define yourself, to understand everything, to become something greater. Everything is already happening now, and you are just the consciousness observing the flow of life. At this point, the final question arises. If there is no I, if there is nothing to achieve, and if everything is already exactly as it should be, then what is left to do? The answer is simple: live. But really live without fear, without attachment, without trying to control or define the experience. Just being present, allowing life to happen, without resistance. Perhaps that is true freedom. Not trying to change anything, not trying to be anything, just being. Now that we've reached the end, what has really changed? You're still here reading these words and life is still going on, but something inside you may have changed. Perhaps a part of you has realized that you were never a separate self, that you never had to fight to be something or someone. Perhaps you've understood that consciousness is the only constant element, while everything else is in flux. If all this is true, then life no longer needs to be seen as a problem to be solved. You no longer need to cling to the past or worry excessively about the future. The only true reality is this moment now. Life is like a river flowing effortlessly, and the only thing that causes suffering is trying to resist this flow. What happens when you stop resisting? When you stop trying to understand everything, when you let go of the need to control, you discover something that has always been here: peace. A peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances, achievements, or anything the mind can conceive of. It's the peace that comes naturally when you surrender completely to the present moment. And now, what to do with this realization? The answer is simple: live. But live knowing that you are not just the character in this story, you are the author, the observer, and the very canvas on which everything happens. Live knowing that there is nothing left to achieve, because everything is already complete. Live with lightness, curiosity, and presence, because this moment is all there is. Perhaps this is the greatest revelation of all. There is no end to this journey, because there never was a beginning. You've always been here,